In 1999, a woman wearing only a dog collar and chain ran through the streets of New Mexico. Her escape exposed a nightmare no one could have imagined. A man who built a torture chamber and claimed to have killed dozens. His name was David Parker Ray, and his toy box still leaves questions unanswered. Welcome to City Shadows Unsolved, where the shadows hold the truth. Cynthia Vigil never imagined that a routine day could turn into a nightmare that would define the rest of her life. She had been carefully monitored, her every movement noted by a man who prided himself on control and precision. David Parker Ray, later known as the Toy Box Killer, had devised a system so methodical and cruel that it seemed impossible to escape. The trailer she was held in, soundproofed and isolated, was more than a mere structure. It was a cage, a stage for a performance of cruelty orchestrated by a man who delighted in domination. For Cynthia, every day was measured, every sound a warning, every shadow a potential threat. She had been restrained on a chair that bore the marks of countless victims before her. The leather straps cut into her wrists, the collar around her neck pressing cold against her skin. On the seat beneath her, investigators would later find traces of gum, a small but chilling detail that hinted at Ray's obsessive tendencies. Her captor's voice did not need to be present. Pre-recorded instructions played on a loop, detailing exactly what she was expected to endure. For weeks, her reality became a blur of pain, fear, and careful observation. Each movement she made had to be calculated, each breath measured so as not to provoke his attention prematurely. But Cynthia was not willing to surrender completely. She studied the restraints, testing their limits in silence, waiting for a flaw, a weakness in the system that could give her even a fraction of a chance. Her mind, sharpened by fear, pieced together every observation she had made during her confinement. How Ray moved, the rhythm of his attention, the way the trailer door latched, and the sequence of his instructions all became part of a mental map she would use to escape. Even under extreme duress, she found a resilience she had not known. She possessed a determination to reclaim her freedom. Her connection to Glenda Jean Ray, David Parker Ray's daughter, was part of the reason she had been targeted. Investigators would later conclude that her relationship with Glenda, seemingly ordinary and friendly, had put her directly in Ray's path. Friends of the family were not immune. The network of trust surrounding him became a hunting ground, a way to identify potential victims who might come into his orbit. This realization, coming later, only underscored the calculated nature of his selections. Cynthia's targeting was deliberate, a cruel manipulation of familiarity and trust. The night she escaped, Cynthia found the opportunity she had been waiting for. One of the straps restraining her wrists had loosened slightly, a small imperfection in Ray's meticulous system. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tested the restraint further, careful not to alert him. Every second stretched into an eternity, her mind oscillating between hope and the stark possibility of failure. Then, in a single desperate motion, she freed herself, slipping out of the collar and chains that had been intended to suppress her will entirely. Once free, she had to act immediately. The trailer, though soundproofed, could not mask the noise of someone fleeing. Cynthia moved with deliberate speed, balancing caution with urgency, her bare feet striking the ground as she fled into the desert night. The air was cold and sharp against her skin, but adrenaline carried her forward. She ran past the very roads she had memorized during captivity, moving not as a victim, but as someone who had seized her chance at survival. Her mind raced, replaying every potential route, every location where she might find safety, every place where she could flag down a passerby or reach help. Neighbors who glimpsed her flight were stunned. In the faint glow of streetlights, they saw a figure running, chains still clinging to her, her body bearing evidence of what she had endured. Some froze in disbelief, others rushed to assist, unsure what they were witnessing but sensing the urgency and terror of the moment. For Cynthia, every second was a negotiation with danger. She had to remain visible enough to attract help, but not so exposed that her pursuer could intercept her. Each step forward was both a literal and symbolic move toward reclaiming her autonomy from a man who had sought to erase it entirely. Her escape was the catalyst that would dismantle David Parker Ray's carefully constructed world. Authorities were alerted immediately. The combination of Cynthia's testimony and the physical evidence left behind in the trailer provided law enforcement with a roadmap they had never before possessed. Every tool, every tape, every journal entry could now be linked directly to a survivor who had emerged from Ray's grasp. In that moment, Cynthia's courage became the turning point in a case that had haunted New Mexico for decades. The arrest of Ray and his accomplices followed swiftly. Cindy Hendy and Glenda Jean Ray, both deeply implicated in his operations, were taken into custody. Investigators began to piece together the magnitude of his crimes, and the connection to Glenda Jean's social circle became more evident. The fact that Cynthia had known Glenda Jean and had become a target because of it revealed the broader, more terrifying reality of Ray's operations. He preyed not only on strangers but also on those close to his inner circle, exploiting relationships to manipulate and control his victims. Cynthia's escape also highlighted the psychological endurance required to survive Ray's elaborate schemes. Her ability to retain focus, to notice patterns, and to act decisively under extreme fear demonstrated not just courage but an extraordinary mental acuity. She had endured a man who sought total domination, who had subjected his victims to methods designed to erase their sense of self, and yet she emerged intact, ready to tell the world what had transpired. Her narrative would become a cornerstone of the investigation, lending credibility to the accounts of other survivors and shedding light on a dark world that had long remained hidden. By the time the authorities moved in, the toy box, for all its horrific design, had been exposed in its entirety. But the true power of Cynthia's escape lay not in the physical evidence, but in the proof that Ray was not invincible. A single act of bravery had torn away the veil of secrecy that had protected him for decades. The consequences of that act rippled outward. Investigators could now confirm patterns of abuse, corroborate multiple accounts of torture, and begin to reconstruct the timeline of his crimes. Each detail she provided, every observation about tools, routines, and methods, was a key to understanding the full scope of his depravity. In the end, Cynthia Vigil's escape was more than a flight from captivity. It was a moment of revelation, a turning point that exposed the extent of David Parker Ray's crimes and set in motion the events that would finally bring him to justice. Her connection to Glenda Jean Ray, the careful planning, the immediate risk, and the ultimate success of her escape combined to make it one of the most critical moments in the unraveling of the toy box killer's reign. Through her courage, the darkness that had lingered in silence was confronted, and for the first time, the victims of his terror had a voice powerful enough to summon accountability. He was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico, a boy who kept his head down and his thoughts to himself. Discipline at home was sharp, tempers quick, and alcohol close at hand. Those early years set a tone of hardness, but it was what came next that shaped the private world he would carry into adulthood. As a teenager, he was given graphic magazines by his father, not ordinary adult material, but images steeped in bondage and pain. The message was unspoken yet unmistakable. This was acceptable, even instructive. What might have shocked another boy became a reference point. Curiosity hardened into fixation. Desire fused with domination. The line between arousal and harm blurred before it was ever properly understood. He began to collect those pages, then hide them. He studied them the way other boys studied engine manuals, tracing the details, noting the positions, imagining control as a craft to be learned. A sister would later recall stumbling on the stash magazines and sketches tucked under a mattress, crude drawings in a spiral notebook. Embarrassment followed, then silence, and the silence allowed the fascination to deepen. By late adolescence, his notebooks held more than idle fantasy. They read like drafts of future routines. School did not soften him. He was quiet, sometimes mocked, rarely close to anyone. He discovered that he could avoid humiliation by observing others, adapting to what they expected, and keeping the rest of himself hidden. That talent for concealment would become a lifelong asset. In private, he drew and wrote. In public, he kept a neutral face. He learned that people trusted what they saw across a fence line or at a checkout counter. He learned to give them only that. Military service followed. As a mechanic, he refined the skills that later defined his private life. Measuring, welding, aligning, fixing. He learned how to reinforce metal, balance weight, run electrical lines safely, and keep equipment functioning under stress. He enjoyed the certainty of tools' torque, bite, grip and the exactness of a finished job. Years later, when investigators stepped into a white trailer in Elephant Butte and found restraints anchored into steel, brackets cut precisely to size, and wiring laid without waste, they would recognize the hand of a man who prized method over impulse. When his service ended, he returned to New Mexico and settled into work near Elephant Butte Lake, tending to park facilities and equipment. He was dependable, unobtrusive, and useful with a wrench. Neighbors remembered a man who waved but rarely talked, who helped jump a battery or lend a tool, who stayed behind when the weekend crowds cleared out. Dogs at his heels, a truck in his driveway, a trailer parked just so there was nothing in the picture to alarm the casual eye. That was by design. Relationships gathered and fell away. Some partners later described a surface kindness that turned controlling behind closed doors, an insistence on bondage that moved from request to requirement. Others left with few words, sensing a boundary they could not cross without becoming something less than themselves. The pattern formed quietly, a search for companions who would accept or at least endure his demands. Approval was not necessary, compliance was enough. Meanwhile, those magazines handed to him by a father who treated violent imagery as instruction had taken root. He no longer needed the pages themselves. He had internalized them. He began translating their staged cruelty into plants. He jotted observations in journals, how long a limb can be held in place before circulation falters, which positions prevent leverage, how to maintain silence in a confined space. These were not the scribbles of a passing mood. They were notes for a project. The project took shape slowly, almost invisibly, until the day it was simply there. A 22-foot trailer, pale and ordinary from the road, fitted inside with the tools of domination. Sound dampening where it mattered. Anchoring points drilled with care. A medical-style table at the center, chosen not for comfort but for control. Shelves holding clamps and belts positioned at an arm's reach. Drawers arranged so that nothing important required searching. Here, the mechanic's patience met the teenager's obsession. The result was a room that once entered allowed very little choice. Around him, life in Elephant Butte moved with the rhythm of the lake fishermen at dawn, boats skimming the blue surface, retirees strolling the campground loops. He blended into that rhythm. The contrast between the public world and the private one widened into a canyon. He made sure there were no bridges. New neighbors saw a quiet man who liked to tinker. Old neighbors remembered nothing out of place. The mask held because it was simple. Offer the town nothing to question and it will not look past the door. In time he found people willing to assist him, some drawn by their own broken edges, others by dependence or fear. Among them was Cindy Hendy, whose later testimony would sketch the routines of capture and restraint with stark detail. Her presence did not change his nature, it amplified his reach. She became a voice that confirmed what survivors described and what the trailer itself proved. But before any of that testimony, before the headlines and the courtroom, the trailer operated in quiet repetition. Preparation. Control. Repetition again. The journals continued to grow. The entries shifted between clinical and casual, as if written by someone who alternated between technician and spectator. These pages preserved the past and rehearsed the future. He noted improvements, recorded outcomes, and refined what he called procedures. When investigators later turned those pages, they recognized how the adolescent fed with violent magazines had matured into an adult who no longer sought images. He produced them, staged them, and archived their memory without film. All the while his camouflage held. Paychecks arrived. Tasks were completed. The truck started each morning. The dogs were fed. People waved. Fences were mended. From a distance, the picture remained intact. Up close inside the trailer, the truth was arranged with meticulous care. This is the man whose path intersected with Cynthia Vigil in March 1999. The collar, the chain, the raw wrists were the visible end of a story that began decades earlier, when a father placed magazines in a teenager's hands and called it manhood. The boy studied them. The soldier learned tools. The neighbor kept to himself. The mechanic built a room. And in that room, every lesson converged until the day a survivor broke through his design and ran into the light, forcing the mask to fall. From the outside, it looked like any contractor's cargo trailer, 22 feet long, sun-bleached, and ordinary enough to blend into the gravel and mesquite near Elephant Butte Lake. A padlock clamped the rear doors, dust filmed the hinges, and the tires rested in shallow ruts as if the box had barely moved. Nothing about the shell warned the eye. When investigators forced the latch and stepped inside, the air turned close and muffled. The walls were layered with insulation and sound-dampening panels, a padded skin built to swallow every cry before it reached the open desert. Steel plates hid beneath key sections, each with anchor rings set at measured intervals. Overhead, reinforced beams carried eye bolts strong enough to suspend weight without flex. Everything about the space suggested planning, not impulse. At the center stood a medical chair mounted on a braced base, a gynecological table fitted with stirrups, arm boards, and broad leather restraints. The vinyl was scuffed and darkened from use. Along the armrests and the stirrup posts, officers noted tacky patches and gray smears, adhesive residue, sticker gum, and torn threads from layers of tape peeled away and replaced over and over. The detail mattered. Straps could pin a limb. Tape could seal skin to padding, hold hair in place, close a mouth, and fill the small gaps that buckles could not control. A rectangular mirror faced the chair at eye level, forcing a restrained person to watch their own helplessness. Above, a surgical light flooded the frame with hard white glare. Near the chair, a floor drain sat recessed under a perforated plate. Shelves along both side walls carried trays of instruments. Clamps, forceps, retractors, speculums, scalpels, hemostats, syringes, and coils of medical tubing. Beside them lay belts, cuffs, spreader bars, gags, collars, and locking buckles arranged by size. Electrical cords were looped neatly beside devices designed to deliver current and controlled pulses. On a higher shelf, plastic bottles and amber vials held chemicals including sedatives and barbiturates labeled in block letters and sorted with masking tape tags. Cotton rolls, gauze, alcohol pads, and disposable gloves filled wire baskets. A tool chest held wrenches, drill bits, rivets, and a soldering iron, the same vocabulary of parts a mechanic would use to keep a custom build in working order. 2 compact cameras were fixed to ceiling brackets, their angles converging on the chair. A third camera sat on a tripod near the rear wall, its lens aimed to capture the mirror and double the field of view. Cables ran to a stack of monitors and a VCR bolted into a plywood rack. Tapes, some factory labeled, others hand-marked, stood like spines in a cabinet. The equipment told its own story. What happened here was meant to be seen again, reviewed later, and treated like a procedure to refine. Pinned to the walls were diagrams of the human body, bondage illustrations clipped from magazines, and checklists written in thick marker. Tools, positions, sequence, cleanup. Near the door, 2 signs hung like stage placards: Satan's Den and Bondage Room. Hooks beneath the signs held blindfolds and muzzles. A pegboard carried keys clipped to labeled rings. A narrow cabinet held rolls of cloth tape, duct tape, and medical adhesive beside a pan of buckles and screws. The floor space was tight but navigable, leaving room for someone to move around the chair while another worked the equipment rack. In the front corner sat a wooden confinement box, its lid drilled with vents and fitted with an interior latch that could not be reached once it was shut. Beside it, a winch and pulley rig hung from a ceiling beam, the cable thick enough to lift and hold a full body without slip. A length of chain snaked across the floor to an eye bolt sunk through the chassis. The geometry of the room denied leverage. Any struggle only tightened the angle of restraint. The most chilling artifact did not lie on a shelf. It lived in a cassette recorder wired to overhead speakers. When officers pressed play, a man's voice filled the trailer, calm, practiced, and stripped of hesitation. The message introduced rules, described what would be done, and explained why resistance meant nothing. Survivors later confirmed this recording was the first thing they heard upon waking. It set terms before a face appeared, turning fear into certainty. The tape was a script and the room performed it. Evidence markers multiplied as the search team moved methodically from wall to wall. They photographed the adhesive smears on the chair, lifted samples, and bagged lengths of used tape. They dusted fixtures for prints, tweezed fibers from padding, and collected hair from a drain screen. A faint stain was cut from linoleum and sealed. Nothing about the scene suggested haste. The layout was orderly, the hardware overbuilt, the wiring safe and labeled. Whoever designed this place expected to use it for years and expected it to work every time. There were personal touches that deepened the dread. A clipboard hung from a hook with step-by-step checklists: restraints, lighting, recording, chemicals, cleanup. A dog collar and chain lay coiled in a shallow pan. On a narrow table, a stack of Polaroids face down, rubber-banded and worn at the edges. Investigators logged them without announcing the images. In a drawer they found wigs, cosmetics, and packets of hair dye, items that did not match a captive's belongings and hinted at staging. The inventory swelled into pages: devices, chemicals, bindings, tools, props, supplies. Not everything in the trailer pointed to a single set of hands. Some items suggested help: extra keys on labeled rings, duplicate gloves in multiple sizes, and notes written in more than one script. Testimony would later fill those blanks, but even without words, the room implied company assistants who fetched, held, or watched while routines unfolded. The design allowed for it. There was room to circle the chair, room to adjust lights, room to work while a camera recorded without interruption. From the threshold to the far wall, the logic never wavered. Sound was trapped. Vision was managed by lights and mirrors. Movement was captured at anchor points and through adhesive where buckles left gaps. Drugs were chosen not only to quiet the body but to fog the mind, so a survivor stumbling back into the world would doubt the sequence of memory. The video system preserved what memory might later blur. Notes and diagrams provided continuity across days. The whole was more than furniture. It was a method rendered in wood, metal, light, and tape. Officers stepped back into the sun blinking, then returned to sweep the floor inch by inch. Sand had blown under the doors. A single boot scuff cut through it. They dusted door latches, lifted prints from the VCR housing, and pried a spent needle from beneath a bench. When investigators first pressed play on the cassette tape discovered inside David Parker Ray's trailer, they were not prepared for what came through the speakers. The voice that filled the room was calm, deliberate, and disturbingly professional. It was Ray himself, speaking directly to his victims, women who were drugged, restrained, and stripped of all freedom before being forced to listen. This was not a frantic confession or a fleeting ramble. It was an organized, scripted speech. Every word had been carefully chosen, designed to shatter a victim's sense of hope before the torment even began. The tape would later be described as one of the most chilling pieces of evidence ever uncovered in a criminal investigation, a guided tour into the workings of a man who saw torture as routine. The recording, lasting nearly an hour, began with a grim welcome. "Hello there, bitch," Ray's voice said, flat and emotionless. "You probably think you're going to be raped. You're right about that." From the very first sentence, the intent was clear. The tape was not simply instructional, it was psychological warfare. He stripped away the last illusions of safety and survival, telling the victim exactly what would happen to her, step by step, as if she were no more than an object in his possession. His words reduced human life to a sequence of procedures, planned in advance, with no consideration for individuality or humanity. What shocked investigators most was how systematic the tape was. Ray described the restraints, the equipment, the rules of his operation. He spoke of medical instruments, chains, gags, and the gynecological chair in the trailer. He warned his captives not to scream, not to resist, and not to expect compassion. He told them that escape was impossible and that their only option was obedience. For many survivors, hearing these words played back during the investigation confirmed what they had endured. The voice on that tape was the same voice that had filled their ears when they were too weak and terrified to fight back. The FBI analyzed the tape not just for evidence but also for insight into Ray's psychology. Experts concluded that it was more than a warning, it was a tool of control. By forcing each victim to listen, Ray conditioned them into submission before laying a hand on them. The tape functioned as indoctrination, planting the idea that resistance was useless, that their captor was invincible, and that survival depended solely on compliance. It was a cruel manipulation of the human mind, weaponizing fear and hopelessness. Detectives also noted the detached tone of the recording. Ray did not shout or curse with anger. Instead, he spoke with the monotone cadence of someone giving technical instructions. The absence of emotion was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. It gave the impression that what he was describing was normal to him, part of a routine he had rehearsed and repeated. It was a performance, but not one for entertainment. It was for dominance, a psychological script designed to erase individuality and identity from the very start. Survivors later testified that hearing the tape while restrained made them feel as though they had entered a world with no exit. One survivor described it as being told you were already dead, only your body hadn't realized it yet. Another recalled how the words drilled into her mind, making her believe that escape was not only impossible but unthinkable. These accounts confirmed what investigators suspected. The tape was not a prelude but a weapon in itself. Its purpose was to break the will before the physical torture even began. The language Ray used revealed much about his need for control. He consistently referred to his victims in degrading terms, stripping away their humanity with every phrase. He emphasized rules, punishments, and consequences, framing his captives' lives as dependent entirely on his choices. To investigators, it was a chilling reminder that this was not a crime of passion or impulse. It was methodical. He had rehearsed, planned, and executed his crimes with the precision of someone who viewed them as a project, not as acts of violence against living, breathing people. In court, prosecutors would later use the tape as one of their strongest pieces of evidence. Unlike testimony, which could be challenged or doubted, the tape was Ray in his own words. Jurors would not have to imagine what he was capable of, they would hear it directly. The impact was devastating. Even seasoned investigators admitted that listening to the full recording was one of the most disturbing experiences of their careers. It offered no ambiguity, no chance for misunderstanding. It was the voice of a predator who had documented his process as if it were standard practice. The discovery of the audio also raised questions about how many times it had been played and to how many victims. While only a handful of survivors were ever confirmed, the existence of the tape suggested a routine, repeated use. Investigators believed that dozens of women had been forced to listen, each one subjected to the same psychological conditioning before their ordeal began. For every confirmed survivor, there were countless unanswered questions about the fate of others who might have heard the same recording but were never seen again. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the cold reality that Ray had chosen to record himself at all. This was not a secret note or a private diary. It was a deliberate decision to create a permanent record of his words. Whether it was for his own satisfaction, for his accomplices, or as a cruel introduction for every victim, the fact remained, it existed because he wanted it to exist. To law enforcement, this revealed a level of arrogance and confidence that bordered on taunting. He believed he would never be caught, and that belief allowed him to leave behind the very evidence that would later define his crimes. The tape became a cornerstone of the investigation. It connected survivor accounts, confirmed the details of the toy box's setup, and provided undeniable proof of Ray's intentions. More than that, it gave voice to the cruelty he had tried so hard to perfect. It was not speculation. It was not secondhand. It was him, in his own voice, laying bare the system he had constructed to dominate and destroy. For investigators, prosecutors, and survivors alike, it was the closest thing to a confession they would ever receive. David Parker Ray rarely acted alone. Throughout the years, he relied on a small network of accomplices who, for reasons that continue to puzzle investigators, either aided him directly or remained silent while the horrors unfolded. Central among them was his daughter, Glenda Jean Ray, and his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy. Both women played varying roles in facilitating Ray's abductions, controlling his victims, and even helping to enforce his rules inside the trailer he called the toy box. The dynamic between them was a mixture of fear, loyalty, and manipulation, each layer more disturbing than the last. Glenda Jean, young and impressionable, had been immersed in her father's world for decades. Testimonies from neighbors and former acquaintances suggest that she witnessed the construction of the toy box, the strange routines that filled her household, and the disturbing interactions between Ray and his captives. While investigators debated the extent of her knowledge or willingness, her role could not be ignored. She had the proximity, the access, and the silence that enabled Ray to continue his crimes for years. Hendy, meanwhile, was older and more calculated. She assisted in luring women into Ray's orbit, providing what authorities described as the human extension of his plans. Her cooperation during abductions, and sometimes her physical presence in the trailer, added another layer of horror. It was Hendy who later revealed details that corroborated survivor testimonies, giving investigators the roadmap needed to understand Ray's methods. One of the most chilling connections came through Glenda Jean's friend, Jill Troya. Jill was 22 years old, serving in the Air Force and living in New Mexico, when she disappeared in 1995. Her close friendship with Glenda made her a person of interest in the investigation. Authorities considered the possibility that her vanishing was linked to Ray, given that many of his victims had connections to his family or social circle. For her mother and Troya, every passing year intensified the anguish. It's been 16 years. Every September gets really hard. "It's just overwhelming in your thoughts," she confided to reporters, underscoring the enduring human cost of Ray's actions. The disappearance of Jill Troya highlighted a terrifying reality. Ray's reach extended beyond the women he personally kidnapped. It was not enough for him to confine and torment. His influence infiltrated personal networks, making friends and family potential targets. This blurred line between domestic life and criminal enterprise made the case exceptionally difficult to unravel. Each survivor, each missing person, each close call painted a larger, darker picture of a man whose evil extended through both direct violence and the quiet intimidation of those around him. Investigators pieced together testimonies, diaries, and confessions to determine the roles of Glenda Jean and Hendy. They revealed patterns of coercion and complicity that were as calculated as Ray's own methods. The women's involvement was not just passive, it was instrumental. By guiding, controlling, and sometimes participating, they allowed Ray to continue for years without detection. The depth of betrayal, the trust placed in them by friends, family, and even the women themselves underscored the horror of the case. Yet even with the evidence, questions remained. Did Glenda Jean fully understand the extent of her father's crimes? Was Hendy acting out of fear, greed, or something else entirely? And perhaps most haunting, what became of Jill Troya? The absence of definitive answers only amplified the suspense surrounding Ray's network. Behind the scenes, investigators understood that uncovering the full scope of his accomplices' involvement could take decades, and even then some pieces might never fit neatly into place. Ultimately, the accomplices became a lens through which the broader picture of David Parker Ray's operations could be seen. Their actions, whether compelled, willing, or somewhere in between, helped maintain a system of terror. And in that system, missing women like Jill Troya became haunting symbols, proof that even one connection, one friend, one vulnerable individual, could be swept into the orbit of a man who treated human lives as expendable. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. The complicity of those closest to him, the secrets kept, and the questions left unanswered all contributed to a chilling truth. David Parker Ray's crimes were not solitary. They were entwined with the lives of others, and in that entanglement, the horror persisted long after the toy box was closed. While Cynthia Vigil's escape marked the dramatic turning point in exposing David Parker Ray, the full scope of his horrors could only be understood through the testimonies of the women who survived his captivity. Their stories, filled with pain, endurance, and quiet resilience, painted a picture of methodical cruelty that had remained hidden for decades. Each woman who came forward carried not only the physical scars of captivity but also the invisible weight of fear, shame, and the haunting knowledge of what could have happened to those who never returned. Ray's system was terrifyingly precise. Victims were abducted, often under the guise of trust or familiarity, and brought to the soundproof trailer he called the toy box. There they were subjected to weeks, sometimes months, of physical and psychological torture. Pre-recorded instructions dictated every action, stripping victims of the need to interact with Ray directly while amplifying the sense of helplessness. Chains, collars, and restraints were commonplace, while surgical instruments, knives, and other devices left visible and invisible marks on their bodies. Small, haunting details, like gum residue on the chair or the meticulously arranged instruments, revealed the obsessive nature of his control. Yet the horror extended beyond mere physical pain. Barbiturates were routinely administered to attempt erasure of memory, a cruel attempt to rewrite reality and erase identity. Despite these efforts, survivors retained fragments of memory enough to piece together the sequence of abuse, the sound of his voice, the pre-recorded instructions, the chilling ritualization of torment. For some, the mental images remained vivid decades later, a constant reminder of the captivity and cruelty they endured. The survivors' accounts revealed a repeated pattern. Victims were often isolated for long periods, given little to no contact with the outside world, and subjected to psychological manipulation designed to break resistance. Some were forced into sexual acts with accomplices, other victims, or even animals, amplifying humiliation and despair. Ray's obsession with control extended to the minutiae of daily life, from the positioning of the restraints to the cadence of his instructions. Every detail was designed to dominate, intimidate, and subjugate. The testimonies also revealed how isolation and fear were compounded by manipulation of trust. Friends, family members, or acquaintances within Ray's circle, including his daughter Glenda Jean, were sometimes used to lure victims. The emotional betrayal of being targeted because of a connection to someone familiar magnified the horror. The victims' narratives highlighted a man who did not just abduct and torture but who wove himself into the very fabric of relationships, using closeness as a tool for selection and control. For the families of the victims, the survivors' accounts provided both clarity and torment. They detailed a pattern of abuse, but also hinted at the unknown, the women who never returned, whose fates remained unresolved. The uncertainty of Jill Troya's disappearance, among others, weighed heavily. Each recollection reminded investigators and loved ones that the toy box may have been the site of many untold tragedies. The emotional toll was profound. The survivors' bravery came at the cost of reliving trauma while navigating the public exposure required by legal proceedings. Yet within the darkness of these narratives, there was resilience and courage. Survivors faced public scrutiny, relived horrific memories in courtrooms, and endured the lifelong consequences of their captivity. They bore witness to the horrors of Ray's mind, describing the calculated precision, the audacity of control, and the perverse joy he derived from domination. Their stories were not just testaments to suffering, they were affirmations of survival, a refusal to let the narrative end with victimization. Investigators painstakingly corroborated these accounts, mapping dates, locations, and patterns of behavior. Each survivor added pieces to the puzzle, providing context for previously unexplained disappearances and gaps in Ray's timeline. The psychological profile that emerged from these testimonies revealed a man who had operated with shocking efficiency, exploiting not only physical confinement but psychological terror. By understanding the victims' experiences, authorities could begin to appreciate the full scope of Ray's crimes, even as uncertainty lingered over the number of women he had claimed or harmed. The victims' stories remain a critical component of the historical record, a reminder that behind the headlines and the sensationalism of the toy box killer moniker were real people, women whose lives were violated, whose trust was exploited, and whose courage ultimately contributed to his capture. These narratives, carefully documented and preserved, continue to serve as both evidence and testimony, ensuring that the terror inflicted by David Parker Ray is neither forgotten nor underestimated. Even today, the echo of these experiences resonates. The pain, silence, and survival of the victims are woven into the broader story of the toy box killer. Their voices, recounting every detail from the fear that filled the trailer to the small acts of resistance that kept hope alive, ensure that the truth of what occurred cannot be denied. And while some names, like Jill Troya, remain tied to unanswered questions, the bravery of survivors illuminates the dark corners of Ray's world, offering a haunting yet essential perspective on the man who terrorized New Mexico for decades. The trial of David Parker Ray was unlike anything the small town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, had ever witnessed. By the time he stood before the court, his name had already become synonymous with a level of cruelty most people could barely comprehend. Word of the so-called toy box had spread far beyond state lines, attracting journalists, legal experts, and onlookers from across the nation. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was less about spectacle and more about survival. This was the arena where survivors, investigators, and lawyers would piece together a story so disturbing that it seemed almost beyond belief. The prosecution opened its case with a clear narrative. David Parker Ray had built a torture chamber to entrap, violate, and dehumanize women. They didn't need to show every tool or diagram again. The jurors had already been exposed to those horrors through evidence logs and photographs. What mattered now was testimony, human voices bringing the story into focus. It was here that the survivors' courage became the cornerstone of the case. When Cynthia Vigil took the stand, the room shifted. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of a nightmare no one should have lived through. She recounted the day of her abduction, how she was chained and gagged, how Ray forced her to listen to his pre-recorded tapes outlining what he intended to do. Her description of her escape, slipping free of her restraints, fighting her way out, running down the street wearing nothing but a chain and padlock, left jurors visibly shaken. Several avoided her gaze as though hearing it directly was almost too much to bear. But Cynthia never faltered. She wanted the court to know the truth, even if speaking it aloud meant reliving the terror. Other witnesses followed. Law enforcement officers described what they found when they first entered Ray's trailer. The jurors heard about the shelves of tools, the journals cataloging years of abuse, and the videotapes believed to contain recordings of victims, many of whom were never identified. An FBI profiler explained how Ray's meticulous notes and organized methods suggested a man driven not by impulse but by calculation, someone who planned his crimes with chilling precision. Ray's defense attorneys, faced with the enormity of the evidence, tried to shift the focus. They suggested that Cynthia Vigil's story was exaggerated, that her memory was clouded by trauma. They argued that the items in Ray's trailer, while disturbing, were not proof of murder or long-term captivity. Some tools, they claimed, could be used consensually in sadomasochistic practices. It was a desperate strategy, and though it introduced doubt in the abstract, it struggled to hold against the steady weight of testimony. Throughout the trial, David Parker Ray himself sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Witnesses recalled that he rarely flinched, never raised his voice, and gave almost nothing away. It was as if he were still in control of his stage, watching from behind an invisible wall while others dissected his life's work. On the rare occasions when he spoke, it was brief, clipped, and devoid of visible remorse. Observers noted that his detachment unnerved the jurors more than anger or denial ever could. It was the face of a man who had built a world of suffering and seemed unmoved by its exposure. The most pivotal moment of the trial came not from the prosecutors, but from the survivors themselves. Their accounts were so specific, so consistent, that they left little room for interpretation. Jurors listened as one woman described being bound in ways she thought no human could survive, only to be freed after Ray tired of her. Another recalled waking up in a haze, certain that drugs had been used to erase parts of her memory. These testimonies not only corroborated Cynthia's escape but also painted a larger picture. Ray had not acted once or twice, he had created a pattern, a ritual, a sustained campaign of cruelty that spanned years. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent. David Parker Ray was found guilty on multiple charges, including kidnapping and sexual torture. Though investigators suspected him of murder, the absence of identifiable bodies made those charges unattainable. Still, the weight of the convictions was immense. Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, an amount of time that underscored society's determination that he would never again walk free. For the survivors, the sentence brought relief, but it was not the kind of relief that erases scars. They knew that the memories would never fully fade, that the trauma would remain part of their lives. But seeing Ray led away in chains, his power stripped, was at least a measure of justice. Cynthia Vigil later said that in the moment she watched him go, she felt her strength return. He had not broken her. In the months following the trial, questions lingered. Investigators continued to search for missing women who might have crossed Ray's path. Families who had lost daughters and sisters began to wonder if the toy box had been their final prison. The justice system had taken him off the streets, but the mystery of how many lives he had destroyed would never fully be answered. In the end, the trial was not just about punishing David Parker Ray. It was about giving voice to those who had survived him, about ensuring that their courage was recognized in the face of unspeakable cruelty. It was about showing that even the most carefully constructed lies could unravel under the light of truth. And though the courtroom could never undo what had been done, it had at least ensured that the man who called himself the Toy Box Killer would die behind bars, his silence finally rendered powerless. David Parker Ray never served more than 3 years of the 224-year sentence handed down by the court. On May 28, 2002, just hours after being transferred to the Lea County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, Ray collapsed from a fatal heart attack. He was 62 years old. The man who had spent decades orchestrating terror, who had built an entire life around control, ended his days in sudden, unremarkable silence. For some, It was poetic justice and abrupt end for someone who had caused so much suffering. For others, it was infuriating. His death robbed investigators, survivors, and the families of missing women of the chance to extract further truths that only he could have revealed. The news of Ray's death spread quickly and reactions were divided. Cynthia Vigil, the woman whose escape ultimately led to his arrest, expressed frustration that he had been spared the full weight of punishment. To her, his death was not closure. She had endured years of trauma, court hearings, and public scrutiny, only to see the man responsible for it all taken away by natural causes. "He got off easy," she would later say, pointing out that the women he tortured never had such an escape. Law enforcement officers who had worked the case shared similar frustrations. The FBI had been preparing to continue questioning Ray, hoping he might disclose details about the women still unaccounted for. His journals suggested there had been many more victims than those who had come forward. Some entries described abductions in detail, though names and locations were often missing or obscured. Others contained crude sketches, times, and dates, breadcrumbs leading nowhere without his confirmation. Now those breadcrumbs would remain scattered, with no one left to explain them. The unanswered questions weighed heavily. For years, investigators had suspected that Ray was responsible for far more than kidnapping and sexual torture. The scale of his operation, the meticulous notes, and the sheer confidence with which he carried out his crimes suggested that murder was not just possible, it was likely. Yet despite exhaustive searches of Elephant Butte Lake, the surrounding desert, and other areas he frequented, no human remains were ever conclusively tied to him. His death cemented the mystery. Without his cooperation, the full count of his victims might never be known. Ray's death also cast a long shadow over the survivors who had fought so hard to bring him to justice. For some, it meant they no longer had to fear him ever walking free, no longer had to imagine him appealing his sentence or manipulating the system. But for others, it was a bitter reminder that their stories would forever be left with missing chapters. Closure was supposed to come in the form of answers, but Ray had taken those answers to the grave. Even in death, David Parker Ray seemed to hold control. In his journals, he had written about his fascination with power, the ability to dominate and to dictate the terms of another's life. Now, with his sudden passing, he dictated something else: silence. The silence of unfinished investigations. The silence of missing women whose families would never know the truth. The silence of justice interrupted. What lingered most was the scope of his deception. To the outside world, Ray had maintained the image of an ordinary man. He held steady employment as a mechanic for the State Park Service. Neighbors knew him as quiet, even polite. His family acknowledged he was private, but they never imagined the double life he led. That contrast between the facade of normalcy and the horror behind closed doors was part of what made his crimes so difficult for the public to process. If someone like David Parker Ray could live undetected among them for decades, who else might be hiding similar darkness? In the years after his death, the FBI kept his case file open, though with far fewer resources than before. Unsolved disappearances in the New Mexico area continued to be reviewed against Ray's timelines. Families of missing women still called in tips, hoping to connect the dots. But as time went on, leads dried up, and the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. For many, it was the uncertainty itself that was most unbearable. Ray's accomplices, particularly his girlfriend Cindy Hendy, remained in prison, but their testimonies could only fill in so much. Hendy admitted to helping lure women into Ray's trap, but she insisted she never saw him kill anyone. Whether that was the truth or self-preservation was impossible to know. Without Ray alive to corroborate or contradict her account, the full picture remained obscured. What the trial, imprisonment, and death of David Parker Ray ultimately revealed was not just the story of one man's depravity, but the fragility of justice when key pieces are left unresolved. He had operated for decades in the shadows, and even when caught, he managed to carry some of those shadows with him into death. The survivors were left to live with the memories, the investigators were left to grapple with the unknown, and the families of potential victims were left with questions that would never find answers. The case stands as a grim reminder of the limits of the justice system. Courts can convict, prisons can sentence, but when the perpetrator dies with secrets unspoken, the truth becomes a casualty too. For David Parker Ray, death came swiftly, quietly, and perhaps mercifully from his own perspective. For those he left behind, survivors, investigators, and grieving families, there was nothing merciful about it. Only frustration, sorrow, and a haunting uncertainty that lingers to this day. The arrest of David Parker Ray sent shockwaves across New Mexico, leaving communities grappling with disbelief and fear. For decades, a man had operated in plain sight, his home near Elephant Butte Lake hiding a carefully orchestrated world of cruelty. Neighbors and friends were forced to reconsider the ordinary routines of their lives, reflecting on overlooked signs and fleeting encounters that now took on sinister meaning. The realization that a predator had moved within familiar circles, exploiting trust and proximity, unsettled even those who had known him superficially. Law enforcement faced the monumental task of untangling decades of calculated abuse. Ray's journals, meticulously kept, revealed every element of his operations, from the design of the trailer he called the toy box to his selection of victims and the precise recording of torturous routines. Investigators examined pre-recorded audio instructions, surgical instruments, and other tools found within the trailer, each piece a testament to the detailed and methodical cruelty he had inflicted. The thorough documentation allowed authorities to construct a comprehensive picture of his crimes, revealing a man who had elevated domination into an obsessive system of control. Even with Ray behind bars, lingering questions remained. Families of missing women, including the Troyas, faced the cruel reality that some answers might never come. Jill Troya's disappearance, along with others who vanished without trace, reminded investigators and the public that Ray's reach had extended far beyond the confirmed victims. The uncertainty weighed heavily, illustrating that even the capture of a predator does not erase the impact of decades of terror. Communities were left to confront the knowledge that evil had thrived quietly among them, leaving scars both visible and hidden. Survivors bore the brunt of the psychological aftermath. The women who had endured Ray's captivity faced the difficult task of processing trauma while participating in investigations and court proceedings. They recounted weeks of confinement, abuse, and manipulation with remarkable clarity, providing critical testimony that exposed the full scope of Ray's methods. Yet the process of retelling their experiences exacted an emotional toll, as memories of fear, restraint, and degradation resurfaced repeatedly. Their resilience became a cornerstone of the legal case, even as the personal cost of survival lingered indefinitely. Psychological experts studied Ray's behavior in depth, aiming to understand the mind behind his methodical cruelty. His patterns of manipulation, obsession with control, and the meticulous recording of every detail painted the portrait of a man whose psychopathy was extreme and calculated. Unlike impulsive offenders, Ray's actions were premeditated, extending beyond physical violence into the psychological torment of his victims. The combination of control, planning, and exploitation of social connections highlighted the complex nature of his offenses, forcing both investigators and psychologists to confront a level of predation that was deeply chilling. The physical closure provided by Ray's imprisonment and eventual death in 2002 from a heart attack while in custody did little to settle lingering questions. Investigators continued to follow leads, revisit tips, and examine evidence for potential victims whose fates remained unknown. Elephant Butte Lake, a serene backdrop to daily life, became the focus of searches for missing women, a stark reminder that despite legal resolution, some aspects of Ray's crimes could never be fully quantified. The gap between known victims and suspected disappearances left an unsettling void, underscoring the challenge of bringing closure to families and communities affected by his reign. Communities responded by enhancing awareness and safeguarding measures. Education on predatory behavior, monitoring of vulnerable populations, and law enforcement outreach became more common, shaped in part by the lessons learned from Ray's operations. The case illuminated how predators could manipulate relationships and exploit trust, serving as a cautionary tale for families, neighbors, and institutions. Yet, while procedures improved, the psychological scars endured by survivors and relatives were indelible, a lasting imprint of the cruelty that had once thrived silently. Survivor narratives remained central to understanding Ray's crimes. Each account offered unique insight, from the minutiae of his daily routines to the broader patterns of selection and abuse. Their testimonies not only corroborated one another but also revealed the systematic nature of his operations over decades. The inclusion of stories like Jill Troya's disappearance highlighted the ongoing mystery surrounding some of his victims, keeping public and investigative attention focused on what might yet be uncovered. These voices provided both evidence and a human perspective, illustrating the profound consequences of Ray's manipulation and cruelty. Investigators also reflected on the lessons learned from the case. Ray had largely avoided detection for decades, exploiting gaps in missing persons investigations and societal assumptions about safety within familiar networks. His ability to operate undisturbed prompted changes in law enforcement strategy, emphasizing pattern recognition, monitoring of social connections, and the critical importance of survivor testimony. These insights became part of a broader framework aimed at preventing similar tragedies, ensuring that future predators could be identified and stopped more effectively. Yet behind the surface of resolution, something darker remained. The questions about unconfirmed victims, the psychological manipulation, and the networks he exploited ensured that the shadow of David Parker Ray lingered. Something far more terrifying existed in the quiet, calculated exploitation of trust and the systematic terror endured by his victims. While the toy box had been dismantled and Ray had passed away, the legacy of his crimes persisted. It remained a story of courage, of survival, and of the complex interplay between horror and resilience, an enduring reminder that even in the aftermath of justice, the echoes of trauma and unanswered questions continue to reverberate, compelling society to confront the depths of human cruelty and the strength required to survive it. Even after the arrest, conviction, and death of David Parker Ray, the story of the toy box killer remained far from complete. While law enforcement had secured justice in the form of lengthy prison sentences for Ray and his accomplices, unanswered questions continued to cast long shadows over the investigation. Each lead, tip, or recollection from survivors opened the door to possibilities that were as haunting as they were elusive. The absence of recovered bodies for the women Ray claimed to have killed created an unsettling uncertainty. Proof of his full reach was forever incomplete, leaving families, investigators, and communities grappling with the unknown. Authorities, driven by both duty and the haunting pleas of relatives, continued to revisit sites, review old evidence, and follow newly emerging leads. Elephant Butte Lake, a serene landscape by day, became a place of intense scrutiny as investigators searched for clues to corroborate Ray's claims of additional victims. Tips came in sporadically, each evaluated with precision and care, yet few led to concrete breakthroughs. The methodical nature of Ray's crimes meant that even decades later, investigators were piecing together fragments of a dark puzzle, attempting to determine the true scope of his actions. Survivors remained central to the ongoing investigation. Their courage in coming forward and recounting the horrors they endured provided law enforcement with the clearest picture of Ray's operating methods. Each detail, no matter how small, the sound of pre-recorded instructions, the precise arrangements of restraints, the psychological manipulation he employed, helped authorities understand not only the known victims but also the possibility of others whose stories had yet to emerge. In recounting their experiences, survivors continued to shine a light into corners that Ray had worked so hard to keep hidden. The disappearance of individuals like Jill Troya persisted as one of the most haunting elements of Ray's legacy. Though her body has never been recovered, investigators continue to consider the circumstances of her vanishing in connection with Ray's documented patterns. Each tip about potential locations, each discovery of overlooked evidence, and each survivor's recollection has the potential to rewrite parts of the narrative. This persistent uncertainty ensures that Ray's crimes remain a topic of active investigation and public attention, a story that refuses to be fully closed despite his death. Experts in criminal behavior have revisited the case repeatedly, analyzing Ray's psychological profile to better understand the mind of a man who could combine extreme premeditation, obsessive control, and manipulation of trust into decades-long abuse. While the legal proceedings concluded, the study of Ray's behaviors informs ongoing discussions in law enforcement, psychology, and criminology. Each new insight reinforces the importance of vigilance, survivor testimony, and awareness of the subtle ways in which predators can operate within communities. The impact of Ray's actions continues to resonate not only with those directly affected but also within the broader community. Families of victims, friends, and neighbors reflect on the chilling reality that a man so methodical and calculating could operate largely undetected for years. The toy box itself, a trailer that functioned as a soundproof chamber of abuse, serves as a haunting symbol of the hidden nature of evil. Even dismantled, its memory endures, reminding investigators, communities, and survivors that vigilance and courage are essential in confronting threats that may hide in plain sight. Despite decades of investigation, unanswered questions and unresolved mysteries remain. Some leads turn cold, while others emerge unexpectedly, reshaping the understanding of the case. Each unresolved detail, the missing women, the unanswered tips, the fragments of evidence yet to be fully understood, ensures that the story of David Parker Ray retains its power to disturb and intrigue. These lingering mysteries compel both law enforcement and the public to maintain attention, ensuring that his crimes are not forgotten, and that lessons continue to be learned from the survivors' bravery and investigative diligence. Yet amid the darkness, the courage of those who survived stands as a testament to human resilience. Each woman who escaped or endured captivity represents both the horror of what occurred and the strength required to reclaim life in the aftermath. Their voices, recounting the intricate details of manipulation, terror, and eventual survival, form the backbone of understanding. Through their stories, the toy box killer's calculated cruelty is revealed, and his reign of terror, though extensive, is framed not only by horror but by the enduring power of courage and endurance. For viewers who have followed this story, the lessons are clear. Evil can operate quietly, exploitation can hide behind trust, and the courage of survivors can illuminate the darkest chapters of human behavior. David Parker Ray's story, with all its unresolved elements, continues to serve as a stark reminder that vigilance, awareness, and action are necessary to prevent future atrocities. The investigations may evolve, the questions may persist, and the unknowns may linger, but the determination of survivors and the commitment of law enforcement ensure that the darkness will not go unchallenged. As we conclude this chapter of the Toy Box Killer's story, we reflect on both the horrors endured and the bravery displayed. While some questions may never be answered and some victims may never be found, the courage of survivors and the persistence of investigators remind us that even in the face of calculated cruelty, the pursuit of truth and justice continues. Thank you for joining us on City Shadows Unsolved, where the shadows of history are explored, mysteries unraveled, and the voices of those impacted are honored. If this story captivated you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share your reactions, insights, or questions. Remember to like this video, subscribe, and share to the channel for more chilling and compelling true crime stories, where every shadow has a story waiting to be told.